Seoul was a symphony of relentless motion, a dazzling, neon-drenched concerto played at a tempo that left Alice Ndiaye perpetually a half-beat behind. The city's energy was not a nourishing sun but a barrage of fluorescent lights, and after a year of teaching French at a private academy, its rhythm had worn her down to the bone. Her vitality, once as vibrant as the thaibudayan her mother cooked back in Dakar, had been leached away, replaced by a profound, marrow-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. It was more than jet lag or cultural adjustment. It was a soul tiredness, a longing for the familiar cadence of Wolof, the explosive laughter of her sisters, the dense, humid air of home. Here, everything was polished, efficient and politely distant. She was a splash of warm color in a graph paper world, and the effort to contort herself into neat lines was draining her spirit dry. The day had been particularly grueling, a marathon of correcting pronunciation for students who saw French as merely another checkbox on a college application. Her head throbbed with the dissonance of their flat vowels. Craving a patch of silence, she wandered into a small, manicured park nestled between soaring glass towers, a postage stamp of green pretending to be wilderness. She found a bench under a ginkgo tree, its leaves a fan-shaped testament to stubborn survival. As she sank onto the cold slats, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tipped on its axis. Her legs, heavy as concrete pillars, simply gave out. She wasn't fainting but surrendering, her body declaring a state of emergency her mind had long ignored. A sigh, wrenched from the very core of her, escaped her lips in her mother tongue. Je suis assez fatigué. Je ne peux plus marcher. I'm so tired. I can't walk. Unseen by her, a sleek black Genesis G90 sedan, as silent and ominous as a shark, had glided to a stop at the curb nearby. The rear window was tinted to absolute opacity. Inside, Min-jun Kim was concluding a call, his voice a low, uninflected rasp that brooked no argument. Handle it. I don't care about the method, only the result. He understands the price of encroachment. He ended the call, the silence in the car thickening. His world was one of perpetual calculation, of territories defended and ambitions relentlessly pursued. He was the heir to the Blue Tiger Group, a conglomerate with tendrils in shipping, construction and finance, whose roots, it was whispered in certain hushed circles, were watered in the darker soils of Seoul's past. Satisfaction was a foreign currency to him. Every deal closed, every rival subdued, only opened a new void, a fresh hunger for the next conquest. He lived in a state of constant, sterile wanting. It was then, through the barely cracked window, that her sigh reached him. Not the words, which he didn't understand, but the raw, unfiltered emotion in them. A pure, exhausted despair that cut through the sterile atmosphere of his car. It was so utterly alien. In his world, weakness was hidden, pain was transformed into aggression, and tiredness was a luxury no one could afford. His dark, impassive eyes flicked to the source. He saw a young woman, her skin like polished mahogany against her cream-colored sweater, her posture a sculpture of defeat. She wasn't crying. She was just still. A single vibrant leaf detached from the ginkgo and landed in her curls, a crown of gold she didn't seem to feel. For a fleeting second, the relentless engine of his ambition stalled. Here was a problem no amount of money or threat could instantly solve. A problem of the spirit. A command, impulsive and uncharacteristic, formed on his lips. He nodded to his driver, Park, a man of few words and fewer expressions. Give her this. He handed Park a bottle of chilled, imported Voss water from the car's console. It was a meaningless gesture, a token. Yet, as Park approached Alice, Min-jun watched, his gaze analytical yet intrigued. Alice flinched as Park's shadow fell over her, then looked up, her brown eyes wide with confusion and residual weariness. Park offered the bottle without a word, just a slight, stiff bow of his head. Alice hesitated, then accepted, her fingers brushing the cold, cylindrical glass. Thank you, Gamsahamnida, she whispered, the Korean awkward on her tongue. Her eyes, luminous and weary, drifted past Park to the darkened window of the car. She couldn't see him, but Min-jun felt the weight of that glance, a direct hit to a place long fortified. It lasted only a heartbeat. Then Park returned, the car purred back to life, and it slid away from the curb, disappearing into the stream of traffic as if it had never been there. Alice sat holding the expensive water, the ghost of an encounter leaving her more unsettled than before. In the car, Min-jun stared straight ahead, the image of the exhausted woman with the golden leaf in her hair etched behind his eyes, a strange, quiet anomaly in his noisy, demanding day. The water bottle incident faded into the strange dreamscape of Alice's exhausting life, a minor oddity overshadowed by lesson plans and the creeping anxiety of her impending visa renewal. A week later, an official-looking envelope with the elegant, intimidating logo of the Blue Tiger Group arrived at her small office tel. It requested, no, summoned, her presence at their headquarters for a discussion of mutual benefit. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. What could a colossal chaebol possibly want with a struggling French teacher? Had she inadvertently offended someone important? Her mind raced with paranoid scenarios as she dressed in her most professional outfit, a simple navy dress that felt like a costume. The Blue Tiger headquarters was a monument to cold power, a towering shard of steel and smoked glass that seemed to swallow the sky. The lobby was a vast, marble cavern where footsteps echoed like heartbeats. Every person moved with purpose, their faces smooth masks of corporate intent. Alice, guided by a silent assistant, felt like a speck of dust in a precision engine. She was ushered not into a standard office, but into a serene, traditional Hanok-style room hidden within the modern skyscraper, a room of warm wood paper screens and the faint scent of pine. It was a statement of deep-rooted power. Seated on a cushion before a low table was not Min-jun, but an elderly man with a gaze like weathered granite. This was Chairman Kim, Min-jun's grandfather, the true architect of the Blue Tiger Empire. His presence commanded the air itself. And standing by the window, his back to her, a silhouette against the Seoul skyline, was the man from the car. Min-jun. She knew it instinctively from the proud, rigid set of his shoulders, the quiet intensity that seemed to radiate from him. Miss Ndiaye, the chairman began, his voice dry as autumn leaves. Thank you for coming. I will be direct. My grandson requires a wife. Alice's breath hitched. This was madness. The chairman continued, outlining a chillingly clinical proposal, a one-year marriage contract. Min-jun's relentless, unsatisfied nature, his volatile focus, was seen as a liability by the old guard. A stable, public-facing marriage to a respectable, unconnected foreigner would cement his image, provide a veneer of domestic calm to shareholders and rivals alike. Alice, with her clean record, her profession, her very foreignness, was perfect. She was a blank slate, a living prop. In return, the chairman said, as if listing specifications for a merger, any familial debts in Senegal will be dissolved. You will have an apartment, an allowance, a life of material ease. After 1 year, the marriage is annulled, with a generous settlement for your discretion. Alice's initial shock curdled into hot, defiant anger. She stood, her weariness burned away by outrage. You want to buy me? To be his decorative shield? This is not the 18th century. Her voice trembled, but it held. My answer is no. My life, my heart, are not items on your balance sheet. Throughout this, Min-jun had not moved. But at her refusal, a slight, almost imperceptible tension left his frame. He finally turned. His eyes met hers, and they were not the eyes of a greedy tycoon, but something more complex, observant, calculating, and for the first time, mildly interested. He had expected silent acquiescence, tears, or greedy negotiation. He had not expected principled fire from someone who had looked so defeated on a park bench. He said nothing, letting his grandfather's offer hang in the air, now tainted by her rejection. The chairman's expression remained impassive, but a glint in his eye suggested the game, for him, had just become more engaging. Consider the offer, Miss Ndiaye, he said, not unkindly. The door does not stay open forever. Alice left the room, her heart hammering against her ribs, the scent of pine and power clinging to her clothes, the gaze of Min-jun Kim burning a hole in her memory. She had said no. But in the world of the Blue Tiger, she was beginning to learn, no was often just the opening move in a much longer game. The firm ground of Alice's refusal quickly turned to quicksand. The very next day, a terse, official letter arrived from immigration. Her E2 teaching visa, inexplicably, was under intensive review, a process that could lead to deportation. Panic became her constant companion. Then the call from home. Her mother's voice, strained with a cheerfulness that didn't reach her eyes, spoke of a failed harvest, a loan taken from a local official that was now drowning the family in compounding interest. We are fine, ma chérie, don't worry, her mother said, but Alice heard the truth in the silence between the words. The walls of her small, bright life and soul were collapsing inward, and she felt the chilling draft of a design far more powerful than her own. She understood then. The offer from the Blue Tiger was not a request. It was a chess move, and she was a pawn being gently but inexorably maneuvered into checkmate. The chairman had not been making an offer. He had been showing her the boundaries of the board. Her defiance had been noted, perhaps even appreciated for its spirit, but it was not an option. The choice presented was an illusion. The real choice was between a dignified, if humiliating, surrender on negotiated terms, or a crushing, chaotic defeat that would shatter her family. With a heart of lead, she returned to the monolithic Blue Tiger Tower. This time she was shown directly to Min-jun's personal office. It was a stark contrast to the traditional room, all cool grays, floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist furniture. He stood before the view, a king surveying his concrete kingdom. He didn't turn as she entered. "I see you have reconsidered," he stated, his voice echoing faintly in the spacious room. "You left me no room to do otherwise," Alice replied, her voice flat, all fight drained away, leaving only a weary resolve. Now he turned. He assessed her, seeing not the fiery woman from before, but one bowed by necessity. A strange flicker, almost like disappointment, passed through his eyes. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a severe-looking chair. He took the seat opposite her, not behind his desk, placing them on a level. It was a small, calculated gesture. "My grandfather's proposal was crude," Min-jun began, steepling his fingers. "I require a spouse for image. You require stability and resources. But I am not a man who enjoys coercion in his personal affairs, even staged ones." The word, enjoys, hung in the air, implying a vast landscape of things he did do out of necessity. "I propose a contract. A business arrangement between us, directly. 1 year. A public marriage with all the appearances. Privately you will have your own suite in my residence. Your life will be your own. We will interact as necessary for the facade. After 365 days, you walk away with the agreed settlement, your family secure, and no further obligation." He slid a document across the glass table. It was thorough, outlining everything from her allowance to the confidentiality clause. It was, as he said, a cold business deal. "I find nothing in this world that provides lasting satisfaction," he said, a rare moment of bleak honesty. "This marriage is just another transaction. Efficient. Clean." Alice picked up the pen. It felt like a surgical instrument. She thought of her mother's weary smile, of her students' faces, of the park bench where this all began. She was trading 1 year of her freedom for their peace. She was becoming a commodity in Min-jun Kim's world of endless, unsatisfying transactions. Her signature on the line was a small, tragic scratch. As she set the pen down, she met his gaze. "I hope you find what you're looking for someday, Mr. Kim. But it won't be in this contract." A muscle ticked in his jaw. Her words, laced with a pity he did not want and could not understand, struck a chord. He gave a curt nod, the deal sealed. Alice had sold a year of her life. Min-jun had acquired a wife. And in the silent space between them, the first fragile thread of a connection that had nothing to do with their contract had been spun, born from her defiance and his unexpected need to make the coercion slightly less bitter for her. Alice's new home was a penthouse in the pinnacle of one of Seoul's most exclusive towers. It was a masterpiece of modern design, vast, silent, and as warmly inviting as an art gallery after closing hours. Everything was shades of white, beige, and steel. The windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Han River and the city's glittering spine, a view that served only to remind Alice of how high up and isolated she was. Her private suite, though luxurious, felt like a very beautiful prison cell. She had traded her cramped office-tel for a gilded cage. Their lives unfolded in parallel, never intersecting. Min-jun was a force of nature on a strict, silent schedule. He left before dawn, a shadow slipping out the door. He returned late, often well past midnight, the faint scent of sandalwood and cold night air trailing him. Sometimes he didn't return at all. Alice filled her days with solitude. She tried to explore the city, but the eyes of Min-jun's discreet security detail, always present, made her feel like a zoo animal on exhibit. She was a ghost in the penthouse, moving silently through the sterile rooms, her vibrant saris and head wraps a shock of color against the monochrome backdrop. She began to observe him, this man who was now her husband in name only. She noticed not the powerful CEO or the rumored mafia scion, but the small tells. The way he would pause by the window in the dead of night, a crystal tumbler of amber liquor untouched in his hand, staring at the city lights as if they were a code he couldn't crack. The permanent tension in the line of his shoulders, as if he were perpetually bracing for a blow. The absolute silence in which he existed. He made no unnecessary noise, as if even the sound of his own presence was an expenditure to be minimized. He was a man of voracious appetite, for deals, for control, for information, yet nothing seemed to fill him. He was like a black hole, swallowing light and giving back nothing but gravity. Driven by a mixture of loneliness, pity, and her own innate kindness, Alice began to leave small, silent offerings in his world. It was a language she understood, the language of care. Knowing he worked until his eyes burned, she prepared a pot of citronelle tea, the lemongrass a memory of her grandmother's remedies, and left it by the door of his study with a simple note, "For tired eyes." She found a financial report he'd left on a side table, a few French phrases used for flair. She corrected the minor grammatical errors with a pencil and a gentle hand, leaving it for him to find. One evening, after a day of particular grayness, she placed a single perfect yellow forsythia bloom in a slender vase on the dining table, a defiant spot of spring in their wintry space. Min-jun noticed. Of course he did. His world was built on noticing details that could be threats or advantages. The tea was drunk, its unusual, calming flavor noted. The corrected report earned a raised eyebrow, followed by a faint, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. The flower remained on the table until its petals fell. He never thanked her. Words were currency he spent sparingly. But he did not remove her interventions. They became tiny, unexplained fixtures in his landscape, like unexpected wildflowers growing through cracks in concrete. One night, coming home to the faint, clean scent of lemongrass lingering in the air, he stood in the dark living room and felt not satisfaction, but a momentary, puzzling cessation of hunger. It was so brief he almost missed it. In her room, Alice stared at the city lights, wondering if her small gestures were just drops in an ocean of his discontent, or if they were somehow creating a tiny new current. The carefully constructed détente shattered on a Tuesday. Alice was reading in her suite when she felt it, a shift in the atmosphere of the penthouse. It was in the subtle, hurried footsteps of the usually imperturbable house staff, the hardening of the security details postures by the doors, the way the very air seemed to crackle with static tension. Min-jun arrived earlier than usual, his expression a mask of granite, eyes like flint. He moved through the space with a predatory focus, issuing low, terse commands into his phone. A rival faction, emboldened by a recent Blue Tiger setback, had made a direct threat. The penthouse, once a sterile sanctuary, was now a potential fortress under siege. Alice felt fear, cold and sharp, but beneath it surged an unexpected calm. Crisis was not unfamiliar to her. Life in a bustling Dakar household had trained her in keeping a level head when chaos erupted. She did not cower in her room. She observed, listened, and moved with a purposeful quiet. Her moment came in the early evening. A disturbance at the service entrance. A delivery man arguing vociferously with a guard, his presence a feint to test their perimeter. The guard was becoming agitated, his hand drifting toward his weapon. Without thinking, Alice walked over, inserting herself between them with a calm smile. She addressed the delivery man not in Korean, but in a rapid, fluent cascade of French, her voice firm yet cheerful, as if discussing the weather. Oh, j'ai voice chuya un malentendu. Les commands pour cette résidence doivent être vérifiées 3 fois vous saves. La sécurité est très stricte, mais tellement nécessaire, n'essayez pas. She spoke nonsense with absolute authority, her eyes locking onto the intruders, her body language open yet blocking his view inside. Her performance was so bizarre, so confidently out of place, that it created a crucial 5 seconds of confusion. It was all the head of security, alerted by the oddity, needed. He and 2 others materialized, efficiently and silently neutralizing the threat. Min-jun, monitoring the security feeds from his study, watched the entire scene unfold. He saw not a frightened liability, but a startlingly quick-witted strategist. She had used her foreignness, her perceived weakness, as a weapon of misdirection. She had protected his home not with force, but with nerve and intelligence. A fierce, unfamiliar sensation surged in his chest, not just relief but something hotter, more possessive. And beneath it, a sting of shame. He had brought this danger to her doorstep. That night, the penthouse was quiet again, but the silence was different, charged with the aftermath. Min-jun found her in the library, a book open but unread on her lap. She was staring out at the city, her profile composed but pale. He entered and she looked up. For a long moment they simply regarded each other, the contract, the roles of husband and wife, hanging shredded between them. Wordlessly he went to the kitchen. He returned not with liquor but with 2 cups. He placed one before her. It was the citronelle tea. He had remembered how to make it. He took the seat opposite her, the same configuration as when they'd signed their contract, but everything was different. He didn't speak. He just sat with her in the shared silence of survived peril, the steam from their cups weaving a fragile bridge across the table. It was the first thing they had truly shared that wasn't a clause or a performance. It was the first fracture in the wall between them, and through it, a sliver of genuine, unscripted light began to seep. A new, fragile understanding blossomed in the wake of the crisis. The armed guards remained, but the atmosphere in the penthouse thawed from a state of siege to one of watchful coexistence. Min-jun began, tentatively, to cross the invisible borders he himself had established. He started taking his evening coffee in the living room instead of his sealed study. He would sit in his usual chair, scrolling through reports on his tablet, a silent, brooding presence. But his silence was no longer just absence. It was an invitation, albeit a gruff one. One such evening, as rain streaked the panoramic windows like liquid silver, he broke the quiet. "Your fatigue," he said, his eyes still on his tablet. "Is it only the teaching? The city?" The question was clinical, as if diagnosing a logistical problem. Alice, curled on the sofa with a blanket, looked up, surprised. She considered deflecting, but the memory of the shared tea, the unspoken acknowledgement of her actions during the threat, encouraged honesty. "It's not just the body that gets tired, Min-jun SSI," she said softly, using the formal honorific. "It's the soul. It's carrying home in your heart while your feet walk on foreign soil. It's the silence where there should be noise, and the noise where you crave silence." She spoke of the specific weight of loneliness, of being a melody played in the wrong key. He was silent for a long time, absorbing this. He, who had never truly had a home, only territories, struggled to comprehend the ache for one. Then he offered something in return, a truth so core to his being it felt like exposing a wound. "I understand a different kind of hunger," he said, his voice low. "Nothing satisfies. A deal closes and before the ink is dry I am looking for the next. A competitor falls and their absence just creates an empty space to be filled. Cars, properties, acquisitions. They are stones dropped into a well. I never hear the splash." He finally looked at her, his dark eyes stripped of their usual armor, showing only the barren landscape within. "It is a void. Constant." Alice listened, her heart aching for this man surrounded by everything who had nothing. "Perhaps," she ventured gently, "your hunger isn't for more things to conquer. Maybe it's not a void to be filled, but a connection to be made. You've spent your life acquiring, but have you ever simply received?" He stared at her as if she'd spoken in a forgotten language. The concept was alien. To receive implied vulnerability, a relinquishing of control. He didn't answer. Days later, Alice witnessed the physical toll of his endless pursuit. She entered his study late to return a book and found him asleep at his desk, his head pillowed on his arms amidst a sea of papers. In sleep, the harsh lines of his face softened. He looked younger and profoundly weary. Her breath caught. This was the man behind the myth, exhausted by his own relentless engine. Moving quietly, she took a cashmere throw from a nearby sofa and gently draped it over his broad shoulders. The touch was feather-light. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For a heartbeat, in that blurred space between sleep and waking, his guard was annihilated. He looked up at her, his gaze clear, unguarded, and full of a quiet, bewildered wonder. He saw not his contractual wife but Alice, the woman who made tea, corrected his French, faced down intruders with sheer nerve, and now covered him against the cold. In that raw, silent moment, something fundamental shifted in the axis of his world. He didn't thank her. He just looked, and in that look Alice saw the first fragile crack in the ice, and beneath it not more emptiness, but the potential for something living. The investigation into the security breach revealed a more disturbing truth. The rival's interest had been piqued not just by business, but by whispers of Min-jun's new vulnerability, his wife. Alice was no longer just a prop. In the eyes of his enemies she had become a potential lever. This knowledge coiled inside Min-jun like a cold snake. Protecting assets was routine. Protecting something that had, against all odds, begun to feel significant, was a new and terrifying calculus. In the midst of this, Alice received a call from her younger brother, his voice thin with a stress he tried to hide. The situation at home had worsened. The local official, now aware of Alice's advantageous marriage through gossip, had doubled the pressure, seeing a chance for a bigger payout. The debts were spiraling. Alice spent the day in a quiet panic, trying to transfer her modest savings, knowing it was a drop in the ocean. She hid her distress, but Min-jun, whose entire life was built on reading subtle shifts in pressure, noticed the shadow in her eyes, the forced neutrality of her voice. He said nothing. He simply made a call. A few days later, her brother called again, his voice buoyant with incredulous relief. The official had suddenly, miraculously, forgiven the entire debt, citing a clerical error. The pressure was gone. Alice knew. There were no clerical errors in Min-jun Kim's world, only actions and consequences. He had intervened. Not as a show of power, not as a transaction from the contract, but quietly, completely, because he had seen her pain and had the means to erase it. When he returned home that evening, she was waiting for him in the foyer, something she had never done. The penthouse was quiet. The rain from days before had returned, a soft percussion against the glass. He shrugged off his coat, his movements weary. He finally looked at her, expecting perhaps a quiet word of thanks. Instead, he saw her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The brave, clever woman who had faced down an intruder was trembling on the precipice of an emotional cliff. The gratitude, the relief, the sheer weight of his unexpected kindness, was too much. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Min-jun froze. He knew how to negotiate threats, how to analyze tears of fear or anger for weakness. But these were tears born of a kindness he had offered. They were a language he had no lexicon for. His usual responses, a cold nod, a dismissive turn, felt like blasphemy. His mind, usually a symphony of strategy, went silent. Instinct, raw and ungoverned, took over. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he opened his arms. It was not a commanding gesture, but an offering, a question. Alice didn't hesitate. She stepped into the space he created, and he closed his arms around her. The embrace was firm, secure, enveloping. He held her not as a lover but as a sanctuary. Her face pressed against the fine wool of his suit jacket, she let the tears fall silently, her body relaxing into the solid, real strength of him. For Alice, it was the first true shelter she'd felt since arriving in this cold, beautiful country. It was an anchor in her storm of emotion. For Min-jun it was a revelation. The feel of her, warm and real and trusting in his arms, did not leave him wanting. It did not create a new hunger. It settled him. The constant, gnawing void within him seemed to hush, as if soothed by her proximity. The sensation was so profound, so alien, it felt like discovering a new sense. He rested his chin lightly on top of her head, breathing in the scent of shea butter and lemongrass, and simply held her. They stood like that for a long time in the dim foyer, as the rain painted the city in streaks of light. No words were needed. The contract was not in that room. There was only the profound, echoing silence of a need being met for the first time, and a heart finding its first true place of rest. The embrace changed everything. It was a line crossed, a border dissolved. The penthouse was no longer just a shared space of convenience. It held the memory of that silent communion. Yet the outside world was not so easily transformed. The rival, a man named Jun-ho from a splinter group called the Crimson Gate, saw Min-jun's focused retaliation after the penthouse incident not as a business move, but as a deeply personal one. The rumor was true. The untouchable Min-jun Kim had a heart, and it was tethered to his foreign wife. She was no longer just a tool for his image, she was the key to his undoing. Min-jun's intelligence network delivered the chilling confirmation. Jun-ho's plan was not another frontal assault, but a targeted snatch operation, to take Alice and use her as the ultimate bargaining chip. The cold fury that descended upon Min-jun was absolute, a silent hurricane that had his entire organization bracing for impact. But beneath the fury was a raw, clawing fear he had never experienced. The thought of Alice in the hands of men like Jun-ho, of her light being extinguished by the darkness of his world, was unacceptable. It was not a calculation. It was a primal imperative. He moved her that night, not to a hotel, but to a nondescript safe house in a quiet residential neighborhood, a small, traditional home with a walled garden. The confined space forced a new kind of intimacy. There were no separate suites, only a main room and 2 small bedrooms. The constant presence of security was a grim reminder of the danger, but within the walls they were alone. Stripped of their usual roles and the vast space that allowed for distance, they began to talk. Really talk. Not about contracts or threats, but about themselves. Under the soft glow of a floor lamp, Alice spoke of growing up in Dakar, the chaotic joy of a big family, her father's dream of her becoming a teacher, the vibrant colors and sounds that composed her memory of home. Min-jun, in halting sentences, spoke of a childhood devoid of play, of a mother who died when he was young and a father who saw him only as a successor to be hardened, of lessons in economics and intimidation taught before he was 10. He confessed his deepest fear, that the void inside him was all he was, that he was incapable of the connections others seemed to form so easily. "You connected with me," Alice said softly, her hand resting on the table near his. In the park. You saw a stranger in pain and sent her water. That wasn't a void. That was a heart. He looked at their hands, so close yet not touching. It was curiosity. It was humanity, she insisted. Your unsatisfied hunger, Min-jun? I think it's been a hunger for this. Not for more power, but for a reason to lay the power down. Even for a moment. Her words landed in the quiet room with the weight of truth. He had found a moment of satisfaction not in a boardroom but in holding her. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating. Later that night, as a sudden summer storm rattled the windows, a crash from the garden sent Alice starting from her seat. In an instant, Min-jun was beside her, his hand on her arm. It's just the wind, he said, his voice low. She turned into him and he wrapped his arms around her again. This hug was different from the first. It was not just shelter, it was mutual. Her arms came around his waist, holding him just as tightly. They stood together, listening to the storm rage outside, a united front against the chaos. In that safe house, under threat, they built a fortress of understanding. He was no longer just her protector, she had become his anchor. And the connection they forged in that confined space was stronger than any contract, more binding than any threat. Min-jun's retaliation against the Crimson Gate was swift, surgical, and merciless. It was not a business dismantling, it was an eradication. The message was sent in blood and silence. Touch what is mine, and you cease to exist. The threat was neutralized, but the cost to Min-jun's soul was laid bare to the few who mattered, including his grandfather. The old chairman saw not weakness in his grandson's ferocity, but a terrifying new strength, rooted in something far more dangerous and powerful than greed, possession. Back in the penthouse, the air was clear of immediate danger, but thick with an unspoken deadline. The one-year mark on their marriage contract was days away. Alice had begun, with a quiet heartache, to pack a few of her belongings. She thought of the freedom she had longed for, now tasting of ash. She thought of Min-jun, the man who made tea after a crisis, who listened to her stories of home, whose embrace felt like the only true home she'd found in Seoul. Min-jun watched her subtle preparations with a growing, chaotic dread. The void she had begun to fill was yawning wide again, threatening to swallow him whole. The thought of returning to the silent, sterile existence before her was not just unappealing, it was unthinkable. The satisfaction of a dealt-with rival was already gone, replaced by the acute terror of her absence. He, who had never begged for anything, found himself rehearsing pleas in the dark. On the night the contract officially expired, he did not present a new document. He asked her to join him on the terrace. The city glittered below, a galaxy he no longer wanted to rule alone. It was unusually still. Teach me a phrase, he said, his voice rough. In your language. Wolof. Surprised, Alice thought for a moment. Dina la nob, she said softly. Means, I will miss you. He repeated it, the unfamiliar syllables awkward on his tongue. Dina la nob. He shook his head as if rejecting the very sentiment. The distance between them felt like a chasm. Then he closed it. He took her hands in his grip firm yet gentle. He took a breath, the most vulnerable gesture she had ever seen from him. He did not speak in Wolof. He did not use the fluent, commanding Korean of his boardrooms. He reached for the language they had built in the safe house, the language of their quiet moments, a patchwork of her French and his Korean, the true language of their hearts. Ne parle pas, he began, his accent thick but the words clear. Don't go. Reste avec moi. Stay with me. His dark eyes held hers, pleading, exposed, stripped of all armor. Tu es mon repos. You're my rest. The words hung in the cool night air. They were not a command from a mafia boss or a clause in a contract. They were a confession from a man who had spent a lifetime in frantic motion, finally admitting he had found his stopping place. In her. He was offering her not a deal but his entire, flawed, hungry self. He was asking her to stay not because he owned her but because without her he was lost. The forever he had never believed in was standing before him, waiting for her answer. Alice did not answer with words. Words felt too small, too brittle for the tectonic shift happening within her. The exhaustion that had once been a lead weight in her bones had transformed. It was no longer the fatigue of struggle, but the spent, peaceful warmth that follows a long journey's end. She looked at Min-jun, at the raw hope and terrible fear in his eyes, and saw not the unsatisfied tycoon, but the man who had learned to make tea, who had listened to her soul, who had found his only peace with his arms around her. A slow, radiant smile began in her eyes and spread to her lips, brighter than the city lights below them. She squeezed his hands still held in his and gave a single firm nod. It was a promise. It was an acceptance. It was her answer. The relief that washed over Min-jun was so profound it left him lightheaded. The void did not just hush, it filled not with the transient thrill of a conquest, but with a steady golden light. He pulled her into an embrace, this one different from all the others. It was not a shelter from a storm, nor a mutual comfort in fear. It was a claiming and a surrender, a sealing of their silent vow. He held her as if he'd been granted the one thing worth holding in a lifetime of grasping at shadows. The months that followed were a quiet revolution. Alice did not move back into her separate suite. The penthouse gradually changed. A vibrant Senegalese tapestry hung on a neutral wall. The scent of Thai boudin and yassa sometimes mingled with the minimalist air. French and Wolof phrases were heard alongside Korean. Alice, with Min-jun's unwavering support, began working at a multicultural community center, teaching French and sharing the stories of West Africa. She had found her purpose and her spirit, once so tired, bloomed. Min-jun still led the Blue Tiger. He was still formidable, still decisive. But the frantic, insatiable hunger was gone. He worked not to fill a void but to build a legacy, a legitimate, stable future. He found satisfaction not in the deal itself but in coming home. To her. The chairman, witnessing his grandson's newfound stability and fierce, protective joy, gave his gruff, unspoken approval. The story ends not with a grand wedding or a dramatic declaration, but with a simple, perfect morning. Sunlight streamed into the penthouse, now a true home. Alice was at the dining table reviewing lesson plans for her new class, dressed in a colorful docket that was a splash of joyful defiance against the dawn. Min-jun emerged from their bedroom, his hair still damp, dressed in a simple dark sweater and trousers. He paused, watching her, the focused curve of her neck, the confident set of her shoulders, the woman who had taught him how to rest. He walked over and, without a word, wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her gently against his chest. He rested his chin on the crown of her head, his eyes closing. It was a hug of pure, contented belonging. Alice leaned back into his solid warmth, a soft smile touching her lips. She placed her hand over his where they rested against her heart. In the quiet of the sunlit room, she remembered the woman on the park bench who could not walk. She thought of the journey from that exhaustion to this profound peace. She was no longer tired. She was rooted. She was loved. Turning her head slightly, she whispered the truth into the sun-drenched air, for him and for herself. I can walk again. With you.